Greetings, folks. In this segment of the colonial series, we're going to be talking about another group of English colonists that left England and set up shop over in North America. We talked earlier about the Chesapeake colonies, which are down, as you can tell, of course, in the Chesapeake Bay region. That's over here. So the first successful English colony in America is going to be Jamestown in 1607. Becomes very profitable, largely because of tobacco and then other things. That's more to talk about later. And then up here, we have in 1620 a number of people called Puritans, and also known as separatists, and we're going to define that in a bit, who all move over here. Now, these guys will not be growing tobacco. They're going to be harvesting other raw goods that the English industries need, that normally those industries would get from Europe, but cannot because of Spanish sanctions and Catholic sanctions on England, because England is Protestant now instead of Catholic, right? So again, the motivation for England to go out and colonize was different, finally, than, say, the Portuguese or the Spanish, because the Portuguese and the Spanish originally, they wanted to send ships out to find a maritime link to Asia, and the Portuguese do it by going around Africa. The Spanish try to do it by going around the world, and instead they find that there's a continent there in the way. And then the English, because the English go Protestant, they're being essentially bullied into having to find another way to keep their economy going, and that means they're setting up colonies as part of an economic factor directly for themselves, as opposed to trying to connect to a Silk Road. So we have a difference there. Regardless of all that, we come over here to look at the Puritan colonies. So when we say Massachusetts, we're looking at this region at first, and then the rest of this is going to be added to it. When we look at New England, it's this whole region right here. New England is just this series of colonies originally begun by Puritan separatists, and then we'll move forward into other kinds of colonists moving in as well. But let's talk about these Puritans, since they're the first guys that set this up. So a Puritan and a separatist are technically the same thing. And the separatists just happen to be the group of Puritans that are just extreme enough, if you will, that they're willing to leave England to try to start over. In a way, if you're a separatist, you've already failed being a Puritan. I'm going to explain that in a second. In fact, right now. What is Puritanism? Well, there's a whole long lecture I could give on this, which I'm not going to do. But let's make it real simple. Why are there Puritans? It's because in the Church of England, meaning the religion of England, within that church, started by Henry VIII, we now move into the 1600s, and there are people within the Church of England, English citizens, who feel like they need to, let's go down to here, purify the Church of England. They feel like the Church of England has itself become corrupt and is a problem and needs to be fixed. And so the Puritans are the busybodies that really want to fix up the Church of England and make it more serious and more pure in the way that they think religion should be. Okay, there's always in any religion, there's always factions that grow out of that religion where they want to change the main faith to be something different, and that's what these guys wish to do. And the Puritans are not the only guys in England doing this. There are others that we'll get to, some of them anyway, but the Puritans, of course, happen to be the ones we know about. Why do we know a lot about them in the modern day? Well, they left a lot of records behind, but they also really were prolific. I mean, they got everywhere. And when we look at this, we look at these colonies that grew super quickly because these Puritans moved in such organized and efficient fashions around to the English colonial sea lanes and end up over here. Why are these Puritans so well known? How come they have the money to do all this? And the answer to that is that the Puritans tended to be part of the upper middle class of English society in the 1600s. They tended to be the people who were in charge of the economic factors that had to do with shipbuilding and maritime transport and moving around of goods between the colonies and England. And so they were decently wealthy, these guys, these Puritans. They may not have been nobles, most of them, but they had money. And so the merchant economy, very much infiltrated by Puritans, is going to have a lot of power through these Puritans. And so let's talk again more about these. The the whole job of a Puritan is to purify the Church of England. Now, if you're a separatist, it means that you've given up. You have failed. You have admitted that you have failed, and you have decided that you're just going to leave. You're going to stay Puritan, but you're going to leave England and go somewhere else and just practice Puritanism the way you want it to be, without anybody there to persecute you or question you or anything, right? And so, a separatist is someone that separates out, that leaves. So the Puritans that came to America were far more radical than the Puritans often that stayed in England when it came to wanting to actually take their entire income and move it into transportation 4,000 miles away to colonies that had not yet been set up by Europeans, which means a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of change. And you got to be pretty mad and pretty motivated to want to leave your country and go into the middle of nowhere just because you want to practice your religion the way you want to do it. In modern day terms, the separatists, the guys that are going to go 4,000 miles away and set up colonies, are not too dissimilar from people that are so angry that they put a ton of money into a spaceship and go to the moon or something. It's kind of a crazy thing to do, but that's what they do. All right, the separatists. Some will go to other parts of Europe, like the Netherlands, and others are going to go to North America and see what they can do. Okay, now this is the ship. This is when this ship shows up, called the Mayflower. The Mayflower is just one of many merchant vessels owned by Puritans that are carrying goods around. And so this time it's carrying goods and people. There's about 102 Puritans on it that are mostly sleeping on the decks, and then the bottom here is full of food and supplies. And so this vessel is going to sail. It's going to take about 3 months to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and it is on its way to Virginia. However, it goes off course and lands where Plymouth is today. To show you what that means, let me go back up to the map. This ship, the Mayflower, was supposed to go here because this is where the English colonies of the time were. And instead, it landed over, I don't know if Plymouth is on this thing. Well, basically just south here, so right over here, basically near Providence. And so that's where this ship lands, and the Puritans feel that they felt that God guided them there, so they decided to set up a new colony right here, and the king will let them. King James will say, okay, that's fine, you guys can settle there. Let's call that part of our colonial territory too. And so that's what happens. Okay. Well, what do we know about these Puritans? All right, it's 1620. There's 102 of them. They're religious dissidents coming from England. They have money. Okay, we know all these things. Basics of this colonial government of the Puritans only. Again, this is not about the Chesapeake. This is about the New England guys. And a lot of their ideas are going to become part of American culture during the Revolution and during that whole transition. So that's why we talk about them. Their law. The Puritan law at this time is based upon the Old Testament, so it's religious law. The rules of the Old Testament, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments, are all going to be the primary form of law. After that form of religious law, there is the English common law that can be referred to. If you are in the government of the Puritans, you are not only a master, meaning educated, a master of theology, you are also a lawyer who has been trained in English common law. And you will have found a way to combine the Old Testament of the Bible, of the Christian Bible anyway, into English common law. You've morphed the two together. So these are very educated people. It's just that they have religious law as opposed to, say, pure secular law. And that's something to keep in mind, because in the United States today, we have a lot of that still left. Although our Constitution and Bill of Rights and our governmental legal system is very, freedom of religion, meaning that religion has no power in our government, we still have a lot of people that wish it to be. And so we have a lot of elected officials who tend to try to bring religion into their lawmaking, and they're usually very clear about that. That's a tradition that the Puritans kind of gave to us, that's still there, this idea that religion should be part of our government. But of course, our government was formed by a lot more people in the modern day, since the Revolution. than just the Puritans. Thank God for that, in my opinion. So non-Puritans were not allowed into New England, at least for the first 30 years. Voting rights in this colony were based on membership in a Puritan church and restricted only to men. Okay? So that's something important. And with these New England Puritans, there is no such thing as a separation of church and state. And people still argue today, mostly religious people, for getting rid of separation of church and state when I think it's probably one of the most important things we have. Okay, what else can we talk about the Puritans? There's a social covenant, meaning that there's a governmental system. That's that compact, this thing, right? There's a covenant between everybody. In fact, the word covenant is right here. And basically, it creates this concept that everybody watches each other. Everybody does it to help each other, but also there's a legal system set up, this governmental/religious legal system set up, where everybody is protecting each other by watching each other. So there's mutual watchfulness. You're watching for several things. You want to make sure in these small towns, these small villages of 40 to 60 people that the Puritans set up in their New England territory, they want to make sure that if somebody gets sick, that they're not going to be spreading disease. They want to make sure that there are no people that are going to be causing trouble, dissidents, and that sort of thing. And the Puritans were very superstitious, and we'll talk more about that too. You have an assignment on this, the King James I era, and there were lots of witchcraft fears and that sort of thing, ghosts and goblins and all that stuff, right? And so the Puritans are sitting in the middle of these dark forests, of New England, and these deep seas that wash right up to the shore, and the Puritans had a lot of superstitions and myths about the evil that was out there, and so they tended to be fearful people of superstitious natures, and they were not only watching each other to make sure they were obeying the law, right? They were also watching for devilish or satanic influences that would destroy their society. Okay, so this is both a neighborly-like thing to do and also a very religiously superstitious thing that they're doing, okay? No toleration of deviance or disorder, no privacy. Doesn't exist within their legal system. There is not privacy. So this is the society they set up. I don't know if this sounds attractive to you as the kind of colony you would like to move to from England, for instance, but I can tell you that the Chesapeake colonies were more chaotic than the Puritan colonies. The Puritan colonies, because of all this, although I don't think people had as much freedom at all, and people were generally very much, again, watched and governed by their peers, the quality of life, the economy, the birth rate, everything was much higher than it was down in the Chesapeake. And I think it's because these guys took care of each other while sometimes being a bit overbearing. Okay? What are some of the rules of the Puritans of the time? Belief in one true faith. That means the Puritan version of Christianity. And then it also, again, there's no separation of church and state, so it was the duty of the government to enforce full compliance to this faith. Education, especially for theological studies. Education was expected of men. Education was given to women up to a certain extent, but it was expected of men. So the Puritan colonies up there in New England tended to be the ones that were a big factor in colonial legislation, especially between the colonists and England itself. The New England colonies become very important because you've got the most lawyers there. You've got theologians and lawyers. Both of them are usually the same people, and they're very well educated people. Clothing dictated by law. There are more laws governing what women can wear or should wear versus what men can wear. Why is that? Obviously, because men are the government. So when men are the only government and women are not allowed in the government, it means that there's going to be a lot more rules about what those not involved in the government can do. So no lace, no long sleeves, you have to wear long sleeves, hair coverings, right? Women were supposed to be demure and fully covered so that they were not a temptation to men. No public displays of affection, okay? Beatings for missing church, right? But also a strong belief in legal rights. So you put all this together and you have a very interesting, very productive culture, but also a very religious and repressed one. Just put it all together, okay? I want you to think about what kind of insular society and protective and maybe scared society you'd have to have if this is where you were moving, the woods of New England, which can be pretty terrifying at certain times of the day or the night, okay? You just have to go a few feet into these woods and it gets dark in there, all right? There's lots of ghost stories that come out of the New England woods that people theoretically made up. This is a berm, a tree area that is near a town called Sleepy Hollow, and is one of the originators of the where from hell stems the headless horseman, right? That sort of thing. These are scary woods, you know. And you can go hiking and mountain biking stuff in them, and you run across like old ruins and stuff in these things all the time. And remember, when the Puritans moved in there were predators in there, not just animals, but also Native Americans who generally didn't like the Puritans moving in on their territory. So this was a dangerous territory for the Puritans to move to, and at the same time, the Puritans believe in evil spirits and ghosts and witches and all this stuff, right? And so just imagine what kind of society the Puritans had to be to combat all that, right? This is Photoshop to be darker up there. You know, imagine it's the evening and you got to travel through this to get to the other side. You know, these woods tunnels and stuff. Terrifying. All right, I put that in here. If you're out in the nighttime and the New England woods, would you go in there, right? This is just the Blair Witch House. I thought I'd put it in there for fun. All right. So the Puritans were fearful enough and protective enough that those early towns all had farms on the outside, and they had walls, these palisades, and then a blockhouse, right? And then around it, you've got these places where people would stand all night long with torches looking out into the woods to warn everybody if there was an attack coming or some other problem. And so these Puritan towns started very small, very religious, very fearful, very mutual watchfulness. You know, they were all there because they believed God wanted them to be there and that God was the puppet master of predestination. But at the same time, this is a scary thing to just go do. You know, you're moving into the middle of the woods surrounded by what you think is evil. Even the Native Americans, if you're Puritan, Native Americans are evil. They are not Christian, and they do things that you believe is satanic. Okay, so you're scared of everything if you are a Puritan living in this territory. Okay, so let's see what happens. All right, how does it go with these Puritans? When they show up, it's the winter, during the winter of 1620 to 1621. 44 out of the original 102 survive. There's disease and starvation that happens. It's also the year where some of these 44 survive because the natives brought food. So that's our Thanksgiving story, right? But because they're really religious, when the ship goes home, the 44 settlers stay because they believe all this was predestined, remember? So that there's a strength in that, I suppose. The idea of predestination of being really religious. Okay, so your first Thanksgiving, and then more colonists show up, and this colony is going to discover that there's lots of raw resources that the English need. So fur from animals can be hunted and skinned, these animals, and then the fur sent to England. Fish for food can be sent to England after being caught and dried, and lumber. England was, their big forests were largely depleted, and so the New England woods, all these, lots of trees. And so just sending lumber to England was a huge, huge economic factor for the Puritans to engage in. So there's going to be a lot of money. This may not be tobacco. It may not all be cash crop stuff, but this is the sort of thing that the Puritans will make plenty of money on by coming to the colonies, harvesting these raw resources, and sending them to the industries of England to process. And here you are, guys. Look at this. Between 1621 and 1673, look how expansive the English colonies get. Look at all these towns, all right, spread out this territory. There are two big wars fought between the Puritans and the natives that lived in this area, and the Puritans will win both of them. Okay, you'll read that in the book. King Philip's War is one of those. Okay, so look that up. And then I want to mention, when it comes to religious organization, There's two towns right here, Deerfield right here, 1669, and Northfield, built in 1673, and Brookfield way over here, okay? It's not normal for the Puritans to set up towns like miles and miles away from other towns. That's not the way that they did things. They like to all be connected to each other, that mutual watchfulness and sharing of resources thing that they like to do. But Northfield, Deerfield, and Brookfield were all set up to be early warning beacon towns, meaning if natives from Canada, there was a war that was going on in the 1660s and 70s between French Canadians and the natives that were allied with the French, who colonized way up in Canada. And what happened was that there would be attacks on New England by French Indians, French allied Indians. And so Northfield was set up as a palisaded town, just like Deerfield and Brookfield were. So if they were attacked and people were being massacred by a native attack, then survivors can run and warn everybody else and basically call everybody to arms. So that sort of thing happened where the Puritans actually paid settlers to live. They paid them a stipend to live in these regions, to basically be there to light the warning fires if there was an attack coming. That just shows you their organization. These guys really knew what they were doing when it came to creating a cohesive new colony. All right, a little background then. 1621, settlement of Plymouth Rock. In 1630, 1,000 Puritans will have shown up. Remember, this was only 102, and then 44 survived. But by 1630, 1,000 more Puritans show up. And then because of a civil war that happened in England in the 1630s, 70,000 Puritans will move to America. Many of them are going to move into New England. Not all of them go there, but many of them. So the deal is that growth is just, there's a lot of good timing in it, because you've got a lot of refugees fleeing from England during a civil war, and they grow the size of the colony a lot. That's kind of where all this comes from. A lot of this is going to be in the 1630s if you look at the dates. And here's an image, a period painting, which shows you the family unit of the Puritans. You know, you've got this child. Notice that this child, probably about 10 years old, is dressed just like the adults are. The Puritans believed in economy and work. They did not believe in childhood. And so there's a lot of rules governing what children were allowed to do and not do. And this boy is already going to work. He works with his father and is learning his father's trade. You've got, of course, the members of the family are all right here, the male patriarchs, you know, oldest to youngest. The husband is right here. And then right here you've got a woman fully clothed, fully covered, looking down adoringly at the baby. And everybody really is looking down adoringly at the baby, because children and childbirth and protecting the child and then bringing the child up as part of your colony was a big deal for these guys. And then I'm going to finally introduce you to a character who was the first long-term governor of Massachusetts Bay and of the New England colonies. He is a guy that pulls from the Bible a statement, "We shall be as a city," this is English spelling of the time, "city upon a hill." Every now and then this shows back up in politics and in writing about America, the idea of being a city upon a hill. That's basically saying everyone will look up to us and see us as being the great Puritans, you know, the great pure utopia that we plan to create. Okay, that's sort of the idea. And that's him right there. That is John Winthrop, the governor of the colony, the male governor. I want you to notice the furrowed brow right here, the raised eyebrows, the darkened eyes. Wherever you look, wherever you move your head, if you do that right now, if you move your head around, he's always looking at you. This is a great painting because it's if you've ever gone to the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland, there's those inverted busts as you walk in and that are always looking at you as you move around. It's an optical illusion. This is basically the same idea, which is there's no pupils, you can't see him, and you can't quite tell, but it feels like he's always looking at you and judging you. And this is a highly educated man, John Winthrop, who is in charge of the colony, and all of the men are basically going to be governing their towns and their families like this guy. Okay? And I want to bring up what happens here. In the 1640s, this is right after the major migration, the mass migration of the 1630s. There's going to be even more people moving in, and it's kind of interesting. By the time we get to the 1640s, the Puritans in England are not quite as radical, if you will, as the Puritans in America. In America, you follow you follow the orders of this guy or people like him. You believe that predestination and God's rule and the orders of God are all going to be interpreted by this guy, by your religious leadership. You believe that that you need to work hard to earn God's love, and by work hard I mean work. This is not salvation through faith, but rather salvation through work. That is what's going on here. All right, in the American colony of New England, you are the kind of Puritan that believes that everyone is watching you because they are, and that you must work to try to be saved. Okay, that's the way that works. In England, it's not at all like that. The Puritans do not believe that way at all by the time we get to the 1640s. So in comes this interesting woman, Anne Hutchinson, very outspoken, well-educated. She had a master's in theology. She had the same degree that many of the people that actually governed towns had in America, in the American colonies. Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is a English Puritan. Her parents have passed away. She's got a little bit of money. She's married. She's got kids. And she decides that she's going to move to the Puritan colonies. Remember this, we shall be a city upon a hill. If you were a Puritan living in England, you were told constantly about how the American colonies were the best Puritans. They were the ones who were away from English trials and English and Church of England style corruption. You were the perfect Puritans, and that's kind of the propaganda that's going from the colonies back to England. So for her, Anne Hutchinson, a Puritan woman whose parents have passed away, who's got a little bit of money from inheritance and is looking for somewhere to go, Anne Hutchinson, to a weird extent, and this is not really doing it justice, but she sees the Puritan colonies as almost like the kind of the holy land for her to go to. This is where she can go to be the perfect Puritan and be in a perfect Puritan society, because that's what everybody in England thinks the colonies are doing. They're perfect Puritans, all right? Now, she's a woman, okay, who believes that she can go and talk, because in England, as a Puritan, she is allowed to go to meetings and she's allowed to talk, and she's even voted a few times on some things. And she's going to be going to the American colonies where women are not part of the system. Women are not allowed to talk in public arenas, especially about government or the economy. Women are completely clothed and hidden from society. Women are this, okay? And so Anne Hutchinson, a different kind of Puritan in England, is going to be going to New England, and she's going to discover how different it is. So she's intelligent, strong-willed. This is in the 1640s, guys. And she's going to threaten the control of people like John Winthrop, the governor of the colony, because she's going to question it. It's very interesting to see what happens here. So she brings in something called antimonialism, all right? When she shows up in the American colonies, she's in Boston, and sees how everybody is basically following the rules of the government very specifically, and that the government of New England is very religiously strict towards children and towards women. Okay, she sees that. And also that the government of Massachusetts Bay and New England is very much into a lot of punishments for people that do not do what the government wants it to do. She sees this and she starts talking about it, all right? She says this, because Christians today, if you happen to be one or know any, Christians today largely talk about the fact that you cannot earn salvation through work. You can only earn salvation through faith, through belief, because that's a very New Testament Jesus Christ quote kind of thing, right? And so the Puritans of England, not of New England, but in England, had gotten to a point where they believed that you could not earn your salvation through work. You only work because you were part of a society, and it's what you did to be economically viable and that sort of thing. But in the colonies, it was taught that you had to work to earn salvation and the respect of your leaders, right, and to keep from being punished. And so she says this in meetings. She actually holds meetings and says, hey, guys, I'm going to hold meetings at my house, and at my house we're going to talk about the Bible, and we're going to talk about books beyond the Bible, and we're also going to talk about religion and the interpretation of Puritanism. And she says this to people: since faith itself alone is sufficient to attain salvation, adherence to religious law is not necessary. She's saying that these guys, people like John Winthrop, the governor, are trying to get people to follow religious law in a way that Puritans did not believe in England anyway was appropriate. Basically saying, follow religious law or God is going to be mad at you, right? It's that kind of thing. And work hard because otherwise God will be mad at you, that kind of thing. And so she's here saying, listen, I've got a master's in theology, I'm well educated, and she actually has women coming to her house, and men too, and they're talking about what is wrong with the American colonial interpretation of Puritanism. How Puritanism has been used to control people instead of being a good religious faith to belong to, a community. And so she's basically saying that, people like John Winthrop and other colonial leaders have lost the path, okay? Now, how do you think this is going to go for her? In an American society, she's moved in there, and she is talking about how Puritanism is different in England, and that the American leaders have gotten it wrong, right? And so what ends up happening is there's going to be a big court trial, all right, a big court trial where John Winthrop and two other judges are going to question her and her beliefs about Puritanism and about Christianity. She's a master's of theology in England. She's going to just talk circles around these guys, all right? And she embarrasses them. She absolutely embarrasses them. And I need to be clear, too, and Hutchinson tended to be very self-appreciatory. She liked to brag a lot. And one of the things that she bragged was that God talked directly to her. That was a point she was making. The Puritans in New England tended to say that you could only get your orders from God by listening to what the head priest or the governor said. That was how they maintained control. So in this trial, she's saying she's talking to God herself directly, and therefore we don't really need these leaders, right? That sort of thing. And it's vexing them because it's the leaders that are in charge of the trial. Finally, at the end of the trial, the Puritan leaders will banish her, and she and her family will go to Rhode Island, which is kind of where failed Puritans went, and then later she's going to move to New York, and in New York, her and her entire family are going to get wiped out by an Indian attack, a Native American attack upon her family. And so what happens is that back in New England, back in Boston, when the news came down that the famous Anne Hutchinson, who tried to question Puritan leaders in America, this woman who was stepping outside of her role, her gender role as accepted, when John Winthrop finds out that Anne Hutchinson and most of her family were killed in an Indian attack, he didn't say a prayer for her. He didn't ignore the news. He didn't say, oh, that's too bad. He said, I see God's hand in this. That just tells you the kind of people these guys were. All right. Basically, that's like a politician getting onto Twitter and just saying the most ridiculously uncompassionate thing that they could say, right? And that's what happens. Okay. Now, I'm going to finish up by saying one of the other famous things the Puritans are known for. It's only one little part of their history, but it's a watershed of change, which is why we talk about it, was the witchcraft trials. In Salem in the 1690s, specifically 1692 and 1693, there was going to be a lot of change happening, and that change led to a hysteria that involved witchcraft accusations. At the time, it was not uncommon for people to say there's a disease, or there is a war, or there's something happening that I don't understand, and then to blame it on Satan or evil or witches. That was something that happened in England, and you have an assignment about this regarding James I, the King of England, and his interests in trying to find witches in England. Well, that interest is going to make its way over to the colonies as well. And these Puritans already believe in ghosts and goblins and witches. A lot of the Halloween imagery that people buy every year when it comes into American Halloween, the Puritans kind of brought to America that imagery. And so the witchcraft trials of the 1690s, of 1692, starts with a slave from Barbados named Tituba, who is teaching young children about voodoo. And those young children, just think about being young children, especially girls in Puritan society, where you will never have a real voice, real control of anything, and you're basically a servant of the men. Think about that kind of society. And then let me tell you this. In New England in the 1690s, there was open warfare happening. The Puritans of New England were under attack and fighting back too with the French, who were up in Canada, not that far away, about a 2 weeks walk away. And so the deal is that there was fighting happening between the Puritans. Whoops, let me go up to the map. All the way back here. There was fighting happening between the Puritans here and the French and their Indian allies living up here. And so what that meant was that there was people getting killed, and there were attacks, and there were scalpings, and there were burning of villages like Deerfield and that sort of thing, right? And so people were kind of afraid of this. And on top of that, there was a disease going through called ergo, a type of brain disease. And on top of that, there's this little town called Salem, Massachusetts. And Salem, Massachusetts is this little town that is actually right here, okay, little Salem, Massachusetts. It's this little town that is going to grow into a fairly big, important town, okay? And the people that moved to Salem were these people, were these separatists, you know, and they were in a small town of Salem. And then over time, it's going to grow into this massive maritime metropolis. So let me fast forward to Salem. There, you know. By the way, witches in America never burned at the stake. Wood was expensive. You had to cut down trees and process it into lumber for the long winters of New England. So the last thing you were going to do was burn convicted criminals with it. So hanging. They always hung their witches. Okay, so that's not important for anything except maybe just the interest aspect. Okay, so right here, here's Salem. Over here is Salem Village, and over here is Salem Town. Salem Village is the old village. This is the original Salem that started as a small fort with about 30 people in it, and over time it's going to grow into a bunch of big farms, right, that sort of thing. Over here is where a lot of the new people were. The new people. These are people that may be Puritans, they might not be Puritans. These are people that own bars and warehouses and shipping companies. These are people that work for bars and warehouses and shipping companies. This is a very lucrative area. This is basically the port town, okay? This is where Salem has a new society of people that have brought Salem into the English colonial maritime trading system. English ships will come into Salem and they will trade for goods. And the people that are doing all the wheeling and dealing and the auctions and the trading are the people that live over here, okay? The people over here are basically your older families, well established, and are frankly somewhat jealous of the success and power that these newbies over here have brought in. I kid you not, guys, some of these people no longer believe in Puritan predestination. Oh my gosh. Some of these people were like Ann Hutchinson, all right? Some of these people are not going to be the kind of people that believe that the government of Puritan society had all the answers, including with religion. Some of these people might be independent thinkers. God help us all. Now, here's the deal. Modernized people, old school people. People from the 1630s, people from the 1670s, 80s, and 90s. Okay, so just let that gel. And then you'll notice in this research, you have a lot of people. The A's are the people that accused others of witchcraft. The D's are people that had to defend themselves against witchcraft in 1692 and 93. And the W's are people who were actually accused of being witches, and many of whom were executed. 19 were executed down here in Gallows Hill. Okay, so the deal is, guys, is that whatever you blame this on, real witches, fake witches, brain disease, hysteria because there was so much confusion at the time, and there was an open war going on, and people had a need to find a scapegoat. What you do know is this, is that there were accusers over here in the old village who, for the most part, accused people over here of witchcraft. And there's something I need to tell you. When you were accused of witchcraft, you had a choice. You could say, I'm guilty or I'm not guilty in Puritan law. If you were guilty, you were asked to name people who were also witches. You were asked to tell people what you did, what kind of witch you were, what kind of evil you did, what spirits did you see, how did you go about attacking these young girls who claimed that they were witches coming after them. And these young girls at first would blamed when they were asked why they were practicing types of voodoo. What is it that they were doing? The very religious Puritan leaders in Salem are like, what's going on with you kids? And these girls have been caught doing something that would cause them to be punished. And instead of admitting that they were just doing what the slave taught them, Tituba, these girls say, well, we're being infected by witches. And so people say, well, what witches are infecting you? And the girls blame unmarried women over here, eccentrics and outcasts, Bishop and Osborne. And then later on, there's going to be more people who are accused of being witches by these girls, who are suddenly very popular and very interesting to others. And they're going to start blaming grudge victims. And then other people will say, yes, I'm guilty of witchcraft, and it's really the fault of these guys and these guys and these guys. The point being is that the only way to not get hung for the crime of witchcraft was to admit guilt and then to name names. And so people were fakely saying, yes, I'm guilty of witchcraft, but Billy over there made me do it, right? And they make up all these stories. Because if you claimed that you were not guilty of the crime of witchcraft, the court of public opinion, along with the religious court, would say that you were lying, and then they would hang you, because it was easier to hang you and get you out of society and let God decide if you were guilty than to actually try to figure out if that person was actually guilty or not. And if you were declared guilty of witchcraft in any way, your land, your property, would become the property of the colony, and then the colony would auction that land to the highest bidder. So we have some evidence that some of these people over here, these old Salem Village people, were actually using the witchcraft trials to actually get land, very profitable property from the new people over here. So it's not all just about fear of witches. Some of it was entrepreneurs using the witchcraft hysteria as a way to get land. So read about the witchcraft trials in the textbook. You'll hear more about it right there. And you have an assignment in Canvas that gets into the origins of these witchcraft trials of the period in England itself, which I think is kind of interesting. We talk so much about the witchcraft trials in America that hearing about witchcraft over in England, I think, is fascinating, where the English colonists got those ideas from. And so, this is I think the reason why we studied the witchcraft trials in America, besides the fact that they were so interesting, is that we find that the witchcraft trials happened because there was chaos in society, fear of war, there was internal leadership struggles, there was newer people versus older people, there was all kinds of stuff happening. Everything that could go wrong was really going wrong in 1692 in Salem. And so you've got a situation where people need a scapegoat, and you've got the witchcraft trials, right? It was kind of a relief valve upon people who didn't know what else to do. But when we go further, we can look at other times in U.S. history where this has happened, and in any American or any human society. So the McCarthy trials of the 1920s, you've actually got people who are a guy named Senator McCarthy, who is actually doing the exact same thing as the witchcraft trials. He is actually accusing people, especially wealthy people and Hollywood actors and other politicians. He's accusing them of being communists, and then those people, if they don't want to get thrown in prison or lose their families who decided that they had to move away from this accused like husband or whatever, or you can lose your job. You know how easy it is to lose your job now, right? If you're recorded saying something and then you're put up on Twitter, and then Twitter makes sure that your boss knows that you did something, right? The war against the Karens, right? Rightly or wrongly. Well, the deal is that that's what would happen, is you would be accused of being a communist by McCarthy, maybe with no evidence at all, and then people just kind of believed it, and the next thing you know, you've lost your job, your family's divorced you, all this stuff, and the only way to basically keep out of prison or to even keep any of your stuff, even your job, was to admit guilt and then say, but it's not my fault. These guys were trying to make me a communist. I only dabbled in it, right? That sort of thing. That happened a lot until finally the McCarthy trials ended. And so, but I think what's more important historically about the witchcraft trials is that it showed the problem with there being a religious form of law that ruled over the people. Because religious law is where the witchcraft trials gained hold, where 19 people who were innocent were killed because people were able to use religious, theological, Puritan law against other people. And so what's going to happen is that by 1700, you're not going to see nearly as much religious law governing the Puritan colonies as you used to see. The road towards the separation of church and state idea is now begun after these witchcraft trials. I think a lot of the younger people who were kind of angry, the Puritans called them the young lights, whereas the older Puritans were called the old lights. Always religious stuff, right? The young lights often found that they did not believe the way the Puritans were doing things still, to the point where you've got witchcraft trials and hysteria and that sort of deal. So you actually have something called the Great Awakening, very religious. The Great Awakening is where you actually see a change of focus. Younger Puritans are going to have a different focus. And one of those big things happens here. There's this priest named George Whitefield, all right? Lots of guys like this, who actually believe that Puritans need to look after slaves and Indians. And they are preaching to blacks, right? They're preaching to African colonials and slaves. And George Whitefield would let natives into the church where he was a Puritan minister and would preach to them. And so you would be a white Puritan landowner, and you'd go into church, and standing next to you were slaves and Native Americans, right? People that the Puritans generally looked down upon. And it's impossible in religious society to all be in there together, worshiping your God and praying to your God and praying for salvation and all this stuff. It's impossible to do that and not start to see everybody as equal. And so the Great Awakening is not only partially caused by younger Puritans who wanted to be religious but move away from the old style of Puritanism that had governed the Puritans for so long, but the Great Awakening is also a major religious shift where education is going to be emphasized, where women will actually have a slightly larger role in Puritan government and Puritan family life, where this is even more important maybe, where slavery is going to be outlawed. All right. Well, we're going to finish with this. I've got to define something. By the time the Puritans get to the witchcraft trial period, the 1690s, by the time you don't just have Jamestown down here, but you also have other colonies as well, like about 500 million pounds per year of trade is happening by the 1690s, where coming from the colonies are whale oil, lumber, and furs, rice, silk, indigo, tobacco, sugar, molasses, and wood going to England. From England comes manufactured goods. So you've got raw goods coming from here going to England. In England, you've got manufactured goods, meaning things that the raw goods of the colonies are turned into luxury products and tools and stuff, right, and sent back to the colonies for sale. And then the colonies make a little bit of extra money by taking other products that they can make from their raw goods, and the raw goods themselves, rum, iron, gunpowder, and they send that stuff to Africa to trade for slaves. It's the first major triangle trade of its type, called mercantilism. So what we have here is an internal system of trade that completely and utterly bypasses Europe, bypasses the Catholic Europe that has been bullying England all this time and saying, we won't trade with you until you become Catholic again. Okay, so England has managed to find a way to get around European Catholic sanctions, and they have created their own system of economy that is going to make England into an empire pretty soon. Okay, this is a huge amount of money coming in this economic system. So raw goods coming from America goes to England. Manufactured goods go from England back to America, and then the colonies themselves get slaves because cheap labor is what makes all this really profitable. Just like it is today, the reason why you can go to Walmart and Target and buy cheap goods that would cost a lot more if they were made here in the United States is because we actually have people in countries with lax labor laws making our stuff for us, right? Cheap labor. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying that that's the reality. Meaning, mercantilism is an early form of capitalism. It's government-controlled capitalism, and that's where this system begins. And there's North America by the time we get 1759, and this is where we're going to start when we get to the next week, because we're going to be talking about the English colonies here, the French colonial area here, and a massive war that's going to break out between these guys. Okay, so we'll get to that later. Thanks a lot.